We are killing it.
You got a killer haircut, so it won't brush the mic.
Killing it. Was that a previous problem?
No, not really, but so, let's do a podcast. Woo-hoo. They don't know what I know. Welcome back to another Zengineering podcast. I'm Adam.
I'm Brian.
And I don't know if it'll show up in the broadcast order because these don't always come out exactly when we do them, but it's been a bit, like a month and a half or something since we've actually recorded one, right?
Yeah, 5 or 6 weeks, I think.
We might be a little rusty.
I feel pretty rusty. Is this?
But it's summer, so stuff gets in the way. We've been doing things. Big
We've
stuff.
been doing a lot of things. A lot of things have happened. Damn
you
right.
Got engaged.
Woo! Sure
Congratulations.
Did. Thanks, buddy.
So when's the date?
Oh man, great segue.
So you mentioned it. I don't. We were talking about the engagement in conversation at some point, and you said, you're like the first person to not have responded to the engagement by asking me when the date is. And I said, yeah, people do that. Why do they do that? Because starting 2 days after you saying, hey, we got engaged yesterday, people start asking you when the date is. Anyone that's ever planned an event knows there's no possible way you've already mowed through that decision.
There's a lot of questions.
Hours of, unless you started planning based, I don't know that I went into asking my wife to marry me 100% confident she would say yes. If you were making that assumption, you could proceed with this kind of planning in time to have the answer the day after. But
2 days is a rush. People get so excited when they hear the news, and it's interesting because it's something I notice this all the time, because I think this is very similar to the response I get from people because I'm such a giant, tall monster. I'm like 8 feet tall, so it's really easy for everyone I meet to ask me how tall I am and then talk to me about basketball. And so it's the same, I think it's the same situation. Everyone's like, I'm so overwhelmed. My brain's going to go to the simplest possible thing I can engage in conversation with is, when's the date? And you're like, oh, man.
I think Mike... Well, to the basketball thing, I think Mike brought this up when we were talking about sports, but I can't remember if it made editing or not. He said he was with you once when you decided you were going to stop explaining to people why you didn't play basketball, and you just said, the guy said, where'd you play ball? And you just said, Vanderbilt. And he just went, right on. And he's like, after that, you looked at me and you went, that's the easiest I've ever gotten through that interaction. I should just lie more often.
So I should just tell people a date then.
And then you were like, well, I wasn't really lying. I played one game of rec ball and hurt my knee and I never played again.
I got kicked in the face by our star basketball player when he dunked over me within 2 minutes of showing up.
That's even better.
First day of school.
But no, where you were going with that was the idea of conversational stuff, like default things that come up to fill a moment of silence in a conversation, or it's an easy answer to you saying I got engaged is to keep the conversation moving forward is, oh, when's the date? Why do we need those? Why is that such a common thing that we both experienced it with everyone around us following our engagement?
It's interesting too, because usually you think of those things as the responses because we say things like, how's it going? Going great. How are you? And you'll get those awkward situations where you'll say someone will say you'll be passing someone at a movie theater and they'll say, enjoy the movie. And you'll say, you too, but they were on their way out. And these dumb things where your brain just says something that's meaningless. But it isn't necessarily just that. It seems like it's situational where all of a sudden there is you want to engage with somebody and your brain just goes to this really simple place. And it's partly because we let it go there. We just go on this chatty autopilot, which is something that is missing in a certain part of the population, and I think speaks to why some people have so much social anxiety.
I was deliberately not talking there because the point I want to make is silence is uncomfortable. But why? Is that what you're saying? Like, so
Silence is uncomfortable.
I mean,
We were
silence
just
is
silent
definitely
for, like,
uncomfortable, right? I don't know if
half
that's
a
the point
second.
that follows, but that's what that made me think of.
Maybe that's where we should go right now, because that is kind of the point of this, right? I got engaged. I don't know what to say. I'm overwhelmed. Let's pause.
Good for you, or congratulations, or I think there's a whole separate episode in just talking about conventions of marriage and all this kind of stuff. But to take it back to the conversational piece, that I think is something we can bang out pretty quickly. I think you ask questions, but I feel like all the good questions that are a good response to that are harder questions, either because you don't want to start off a story because you don't want to stand there while they tell a long story, especially if you don't know them well, and you don't, or possibly uncomfortable because they have to do with emotions. Like, people don't like to talk about their emotions. And so if you say, how you feeling? I mean, most likely they're just going to go, great. But like, you're down this weird road now of talking about how a life event makes you feel. And
should we not just be responding with great when people ask that question? Sometimes I don't. And I actually almost always, if I don't feel great and I admit that to someone, I almost always have an interesting conversation. For some reason, I feel
go with great because I'm playing yes and I'm trying to move the conversation forward. But there are absolutely people where I'm like, oh no.
Most of the time,
I'm a bad choice.
Part of my brain is saying, just say great so you can move on and not have to be in a conversation.
Right. So I think part of the problem that introverted people have is a discomfort with bullshit conversation. And if you're going to go out in public and you're going to exist among people, most of the conversations you have are hollow, and like you just said, you just want to get through it so you can have been polite and then go back to thinking about whatever you were thinking about in silence, and we're perfectly happy doing that.
Yeah. On some level, that's our own fault when we get stuck in that situation, you know?
That's why I go with just ask questions.
Yeah.
And you know who I learned that from? Powell. That's what Powell does. Powell, I watched him in so many interactions with people he would walk up to cold at like trade shows. And he just, if it ever slows down for a second, he asks questions.
Yeah, that dude's been to a lot of trade shows. No, he was pivotal in my limited capability in social interaction. Bro, just find out what they're interested in, and then they'll talk. That's the key. If you don't want to talk, you got to figure out what their hobby is.
You don't want to talk.
Often the question can be,
you don't want to just
what's your hobby?
Stop talking and walk away. you have to get them to talk.
Dude, what's the thing you're most interested in life? And then you can kind of just sit back and chill and the conversation happens.
Right.
But that's a weird question to ask people. We should teach kids that.
Part of that though is interesting because it's like then you have to learn to listen, because if you're going to have if you want to do the best at having the next question to keep them talking, you have to listen to what they're saying and you have to pull the question out of that. You can't just be Larry King with like a list of questions and then he's the worst. I can't believe he's so successful because he and maybe I just caught him in his latter years when he doesn't give a fuck, but like somebody will be talking about something and there'll be a reasonable next question, like a thing that thing brought up. I'm like, oh man, now I want to know this. And he just powers ahead with whatever's on his card, even if it's unrelated. Question 6, completely unrelated to the previous question. And I'm there going, oh, if he was good at this, he would have asked the obvious next question. How is this your job?
Now's your chance to show him how it's done, Kurt. We got this.
I ask you questions.
We got this.
Didn't I say at the top, how you feeling? How'd it go down? I asked something like that.
Yeah, you totally asked some questions. It was great.
Anyway, so I guess that's our. We got to cut it off and go to the next topic. The timer. Yeah. The timer is dinged.
What's our timer at?
But conversation, man.
That for fucking ever.
Don't hate on marriage, and I don't know, where'd we end up on that? I don't know. Whatever. Hate on marriage if you want, but just keep asking questions. That's how you mow through an awkward conversation. But I guess that doesn't even get us to the point of like ask better questions than when's the date. Why does the date matter? That's the thing. Like, why does it even, like, if I say May or I say fall, like you're not invited.
if you ask that question, you're uninvited.
You care too much about attending this, therefore you're not invited.
You're over enthusiastic. I'm putting you on the maybe list.
Next thing we got for today says Star Wars API.
Ooh, what's that?
You sent me the link.
Yeah, but you said you looked at it. I just did a blind link pass to you.
URL. You saw the headline and went, "Oh."
Yeah, I was like, "Herb will dig this. It's got Star Wars in it."
I do that pretty often. Yeah. So from my minimal reading of the documentation, it's an API by which you can access. Basically, you can programmatically call up any nerd detail from the annals of Star Wars lore, everything from ship specs to character names, character backgrounds, character whatever. Like it's basically just an API for you to be able to do any silly thing, probably make a game that you could dream up while just using API calls instead
of... What's an API?
Why are you asking me that? I'm a philosopher.
Because I'm hosting right now. We switched roles. Didn't you get the text?
Well, you're gonna have to tell the people what an API is since you're the software engineer.
All right, I'll do it. So
I could muddle through it, but that would be a waste of time.
Well, it's a really interesting thing because it's really simple, but they drive most of the stuff you interact with. I mean, it's a way to it's a basically you make a little programming language around information that you want to make available or around functions with software that you want to make available. And so then I have this documentation that says, hey, I want to know a Star Wars character's name. Type this in to send this over to this little software
package. Use this line of code, and I'll return that character's name.
So it's a way to standardize how to pull up information, basically.
And so when somebody says, like when Twitter says they have a public API, that means if you get an access code from them, so they know who you are, anytime you make a data call, you can pull up basically any information in Twitter. The message, who put it up, when they put it up, how people responded to it, all that stuff is all just like in a big ass list in the documentation that says, if you want this piece of information, use this variable. If you want this piece of information, use this variable. And it makes it so you can have your computer hit Google and get back results within your program and not have to write a whole separate thing to fake it through the front end, which you can do, like crawlers do, which we talked about in the search engine episode.
It's a neat little. I mean, APIs aren't a new concept, but in the sense of sort of the modern internet, where you have all these websites with all this information that people want. Like take Yelp, for instance, they have business listings. I think they have an API, but anyway, all these apps people have on their phones, they basically tie in with these APIs from other companies, and they're able to pull up information and share it and search it, and it's cool. It's a really neat thing that's emerging.
And so if you want a deeper dive on this, dig into our second episode or third episode. I don't know. One of our first 5, we talked about really deep the specifics of how search engines work. So we talked in that episode about how search engines break stuff down, right? And you walked through the process of indexing, which is when a crawler goes through all the content on the site and reorganizes it so it's better for Google's purposes. The idea of an API is there's all this cool information getting spit out of Twitter, but it's currently plugged into the form that they wanted to use it. With the API, lets you use it in whatever form you want. It's just an access protocol for this vast quantity of information. So the Star Wars API is they've taken all of these details, like everything you would cram into a vast encyclopedia of Star Wars, and they've made it so that you can use a program to pull up those informations based on the variables that your program is going to want to use anyway, instead of having to write a whole new thing. And so what can be done with it is less interesting to me than the idea of doing that to data. Because what you're doing when you do that with Star Wars, which everything that exists for Star Wars has come up in a narrative context, or someone's made up and put into a manual that's a fake manual for this universe. But you took this thing that by its nature has to be delivered in a linear fashion because you're telling a story. Here's this detail. Here's who this person is. Here's what they did. Here's what they, the ship they were in, blah, blah, blah. Like, we've taken this universe that is all contained in words and pictures because of the medium that the stories have been delivered through. We built a means to access that data out of order to repurpose it for other things. We took the narrative and we went, we need this out. We need all of this data you got in here. We need it outside of this obnoxious narrative structure.
I'll give the examples off of the main
linear
page
structure.
Of the website. The little code samples. One of them says, for planet in Swappy, get all planets, order by diameter. Roughly, I read the code, pseudocode.
Okay, so you can use this to build a star map of that planet system that you could potentially navigate in a video game or something, right?
Totally.
But you can do it by calling this thing that promises, so the essential conceit of this API is we're going to give you accurate to canon or whatever information for whatever you want to do with it. So if you want a layout of the Dagobah system, you just ping their API with 2 things of code, and it's going to hit you back with a shit ton of data that you can repurpose into how these modeled planets should be laid out. So you don't have to do that research yourself in order to make a game in which you hop planet to planet in the Dagobah system. I'm assuming that there's more than one planet, right? They call it a system.
According to the main documentation, there are currently 61 planets in the Star Wars API, which doesn't seem like that many planets. I think there would be more planets in the Star Wars realm.
At least like 8 of them blew up at the end of The Force Awakens. Did I just spoil that? I'm sorry.
87. Yeah, that was so absurd. Come on. 87 people. We could probably... Do you think we could spit off 87 characters in Star Wars right now if we tried?
Oh, man.
Should we try? Would people listen?
We can always cut it out if we can't. 85, 86.
87. Well, 88 if we wanted to be better than the Star Wars API. Do you think we are?
I think it would be a fun exercise, but I don't think we could do that.
Chewie, Han Solo, Princess Leia, Darth Vader, Darth Maul,
Luke.
C-3PO, Luke Skywalker.
Yeah, C-3PO. That little droid that gets his feet burned. There's the other droid that's red that's standing next to C-3PO.
Neither of those
There's
count.
Like 6 Jawas. There's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Obi-Wan, we're up to 9.
Darth Sidious.
Sure. All the new characters make me cringe when I say their names.
Mothma or whatever.
Mon Mothma.
There's Squid Face. It's a trap. What was he?
Squid Face?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Catfish Face.
Yeah.
Catfish Face.
Sorry, you're right. Catfish Face.
I'd say we're up to like 12 and a half.
The Emperor Palpatine. We left him out. Boba Fett. Jabba the Hutt.
Oh, strong.
Salacious Crumb.
Who's that?
The little like guy that sits next to him and picks out C-3PO's eye.
That little bitch.
There's the Rancor. Does that count?
Yep. Hell yeah.
The Rancor trainer dude has a name. I can't remember his name. Wasn't there a Ewok named Wicket?
Yeah, and they made a spin-off about him.
Yeah.
But he might have only been in the spin-off. There was like a Ewok movie. That was a scary movie. I haven't thought of that movie in a long time.
Lando.
Do you know what that... Lando's a jerk.
The dude with the record, with the headphones on, and Lando's place has a name.
He doesn't count. He didn't do anything. He's definitely not in the Star Wars API.
Led Darth Vader to them.
He did? That guy's a dick.
You ever read Tales from Jabba's Palace? It was a collection of short stories that all used as prompt minor characters in that scene.
No, that seems fun.
It was fun. But no, so the idea of reordering information for that purpose, right? Like this idea that we're so into data as being important, but then the idea of an API is to unencumber it from whatever context was implied by the way that it was collected or initially delivered, right? So the API, a Star Wars API, is basically indexing any information they think you might want to use for I don't know what.
Yeah.
And saying, here, you can use it in whatever order you want.
let you pull it up and do fun stuff with it.
Here's how you pull it up. It's weird because it ends up being this, like, if they were to make decisions about the gravity on any given planet based on its size and put it in that API, they're building, like, this is how we know. The fact that we're already doing this just because we think it's cool is how we know that we're living in a simulation.
Mm-hmm.
They're building the parameters, like the laws of nature for this simulation universe. Like, if they know the mass of all of those planets, then we know what the gravitational acceleration force would be based on that mass and the composition of those planets. Like, that's literally an API that contains the laws of gravity for that planet if you want to do whatever on that planet, right?
I saw a really interesting article.
When you drop a ball and it falls, it's just an API call.
Totally. It's just an API call on some really, really good iPhone, like iPhone 24. I saw an interview with Elon Musk the other day where an audience member kept asking him about living in a simulation. And his answer was, it seems very likely that we're living in a simulation. And the audience member...
the chance is 1 in billions that we're not living in a simulation. And then the dude interviewing him kept pressing it. He kept going, that's not an answer, yes or no.
You got to give me an answer.
And he wouldn't back down from just saying that.
It was interesting because it's totally an answer to say, no, it's pretty likely. But I can't say that we are for sure.
Yeah, he definitely answered it kind of awkward. But his reasoning, do you want to go through his reasoning?
Well, I think he eventually told the guy to shut up, basically. He was like,
first
quit trying to get a soundbite from me. My answer is
but this is where I think it was Walt Mossberg kept chasing it. And he said, well, explain your reasoning. And he said, 40 years ago we had Pong, and now we have competent enough that people are excited, legitimately, virtual reality. If you follow that curve for 1,000 years, either an extinction event happens or we're at least able to create simulations like that. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a third option, which is we find simulations like that boring, so we just don't do it. But his reasoning kind of holds up. I mean, we seem to want to, this goes back to our photography episode. We're talking about why do you take pictures? Because you're preserving a little chunk of reality. Yeah. Like, we seem to have an obsession with preserving and reproducing reality. It makes sense that someone out there wants to create a simulation. We want to
control our reality. So we pump our information into all these APIs. And then now
we're back to that funny... We're back to that funny place, though, where it's like, if you chase that far enough, you start to get to philosophical conversations. Like, when people say, well, why did God create evil if he's supposed to be all knowing and all good?
It's a good question.
Well, then their answer is usually, well, you can't have good without bad. And so what if we try a simulation where everything's good all the time and it's really boring? So then maybe we would go and inject some evil, but that ends up when you say, well, would you do that? Now you're having a philosophical conversation.
No, bro, you just keep injecting more good. You make the apples that much more delicious.
But how do you know if it's good? This is gluttonous behavior is what it is. More because flavors.
The apple I gave you yesterday is not as delicious. It's very obvious. You make the snake smaller and the apple's bigger and more golden and more delicious.
Well, so we could either, do you want to talk about the third thing or cut it off? We can save it for the next one, but then we can tease the next one, I guess.
Let's tease. People like to be teased.
What we were just talking about, the way that we already seem to be chasing the idea of creating a simulation ties back to our general thread about this interconnectivity and sort of the idea of technology. There's been a lot of talk about the Olympics recently because certain demographics, millennials particularly, didn't really watch the Olympics so much. And a lot of people are publishing stuff about, why that is, and mostly blaming millennials for not being interested in the Olympics, when the real answer is, if you didn't have broadcast television, it was really hard to watch the Olympics.
Are we talking about this or not talking about this?
No. Just in the next one, we can get into whose fault that really is.
In the next episode, join us as we discuss NBC's broadcast policies.
broadcast
2016
strategies,
Summer Olympics,
content delivery strategies,
and millennials' refusal to participate in the system that helped create them.
But isn't that just how every generation behaves?
Join us next time.
Join us.
Okay,
let's get out of here. I'm Adam.
Thanks for hanging out. My name's Brian.
Thanks for hanging out for another one. I didn't deliver any of the social anything, but who cares? Go back where you found us again.
It's been really good.
Tell some friends. Talk. We're
everywhere.
At this point, the buffer probably won't run out for another couple months, but I've given up posting interesting things on the social media. If you want to talk to us. We'll talk back, but otherwise,
yeah,
too much work. Just
give us a shout.
Come here if you want the interesting things. That's what we're here for. Okay. Have a good one. See you next week.
Wonderful.